18 miners vanished inside the Black Rock mine in Nevada on November 2, 1987. A catastrophic collapse sealed the entrance and buried the men under 1 million tons of rock and earth, their voices silenced in an instant. For 38 years, their fate was a grim certainty, their tomb a permanent scar on the landscape. The case was closed, a tragedy filed away as a terrible accident. But it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't the end of the story. 38 years later, a geothermal drilling team working on the same forgotten piece of land would hit something that wasn't on any geological chart. Their deep earth camera would push through the darkness and find a small, intact cavern deep within the mountain. And on the wall of that cavern, it would find a message scrawled in chalk during the final, desperate hours. It was a message that would expose a lie buried for decades and reveal a truth more sinister than anyone could have ever imagined. What those men wrote on the wall would not only explain how they died, it would identify their killer. The town of Jericho Springs was more of an outpost than a community, a small collection of houses and a single dusty main street carved into the unforgiving Nevada landscape. It existed for one reason: the Black Rock mine. The men who worked its dangerous seams were the town's lifeblood. They weren't just colleagues. They were neighbors, fathers, sons, and brothers. Frank Massey, the shift foreman, was the unofficial mayor of this underground world. At 52, his face was a roadmap of his years spent in the dark, but his eyes were sharp and he carried the respect of every man on his crew. Frank was methodical, a stickler for safety in an industry that often prioritized speed over caution. He was saving up for a small ranch where he and his wife, Clara, could finally retire, a dream he spoke of often during coffee breaks. Then there was Leo Lucky Gallo, the youngest on the shift at just 21. He was a rookie, still learning the rhythms of the rock. His nickname was ironic. He was clumsy and perpetually covered in more grime than anyone else, but his grin was infectious. His real luck was back home. His wife Maria was 9 months pregnant with their first child, a daughter. His ambition was simple and profound: to be there for the birth, to hold his baby girl, and to give her a life better than the one he'd had. Among the veterans was Sam Jones, a quiet, powerful man who had followed his own father into the mine. He was the crew's rock, the one men turned to when their nerves frayed. He communicated more with a steady nod than with words, his strength a silent comfort to the younger miners. His goal was to see his 2 sons through college, ensuring they would never have to set foot in a mine themselves. These were not faceless workers. They were men with vivid lives waiting for them at the surface. They shared stories of their children's first steps, debated sports teams, and planned weekend fishing trips. They spoke of mortgages to pay, trucks to fix, and futures to build. The mine was not their life. It was the engine that powered their lives. The air they breathed underground was thick with dust and the smell of diesel, but it was filled with the promise of a paycheck that meant food on the table, a new pair of shoes for a growing child, a future for their families. The bond they shared was forged in darkness and danger, a brotherhood understood only by those who descend into the earth each day, trusting the man next to them with their life. It was this vibrant tapestry of hopes, dreams, and relationships that was torn apart on that cold November morning. The world didn't just lose 18 miners. It lost husbands, fathers-to-be, and cornerstones of a community that depended on them for everything. The shift on November 2nd, 1987, began like any other, under a sky still bruised with the colors of dawn. The air was cold, biting at the exposed skin of the men as they gathered near the mine entrance, their headlamps cutting sharp cones of light through the morning gloom. There was the usual banter, the sharing of thermoses filled with hot coffee, but an undercurrent of tension rippled through the crew. For the past week, the mountain had been talking. Strange groans and tremors, deeper and more frequent than the usual settling of rock, had put the more experienced miners on edge. The day before, Frank Massey had formally logged his concerns with the mine superintendent, a corporate man from the head office named Arthur Henderson. Frank had pointed to the Widowmaker seam, a notoriously unstable section of quartz they were being pushed to excavate. He argued for additional support beams and a slower pace. Henderson had dismissed his concerns outright. The parent company, Consolidated Minerals, had demanding production quotas, and the seam was rich with high-grade ore. Delays were not an option. "The engineers have cleared it, Frank." Henderson had said, his tone leaving no room for debate. Just get your men in there and get the job done. The words echoed in Frank's mind as he led his 17-man crew into the elevator cage that would plunge them thousands of feet into the earth. As they descended, the familiar smells of damp earth and machinery filled the air. Leo Gallo nervously tapped his foot, his thoughts on his wife Maria and their imminent arrival. He'd told the other men he was going to name his daughter Hope. Sam Jones stood silently, his gaze fixed on the descending rock walls, his jaw tight. He'd noticed fresh cracks in the support timbers that morning, small fissures that hadn't been there the day before. He made a mental note to mention it to Frank again once they reached the workface. The work began. The rhythmic clang of machinery and the grinding of drills filled the tunnels. For hours, everything seemed normal. But then, small signs of trouble began to multiply. A fine dust heavier than usual started to rain down from the ceiling. The low groans from deep within the rock grew louder, more insistent. Frank ordered 2 men to start reinforcing a section of the main tunnel, a direct violation of Henderson's directive to focus solely on extraction. It was a risky decision, one that could get him fired, but his instincts screamed that something was wrong. Around 10:45 a.m., a shudder ran through the entire mine, violent enough to knock men off their feet. The lights flickered ominously. A sudden sharp crack, like a rifle shot, echoed from the direction of the Widowmaker seam. Frank grabbed the radio. "All crews, pull back to the main shaft, now." But it was too late. Before he could finish his sentence, the world dissolved into a deafening roar. It wasn't a rumble. It was an explosion of sound, a physical force that slammed the air from their lungs. The ground heaved violently, and the ancient rock, held in check for millennia, finally surrendered. Timbers splintered like matchsticks, and the ceiling of the main access tunnel collapsed in a tidal wave of stone and earth, sealing them in absolute, impenetrable darkness. The sound of the collapse was a low, guttural thunder that rolled through Jericho Springs, rattling windows and shaking coffee cups off tables. At the mine's surface, a massive plume of dust and debris erupted from the main adit, a geyser of pulverized rock that blotted out the late morning sun. Then an eerie silence fell, broken only by the panicked shouts of the surface crew. The power to the entire site had been cut. The constant hum of ventilation fans and machinery had vanished. The first to realize the true horror of the situation was the hoist operator, who saw his communication lines go dead and his depth indicators spin wildly before freezing. He grabbed his radio, his voice cracking with panic. "Cage is gone! I've lost all contact with Massey's crew!" Within minutes, the first wives and family members began to arrive at the mine's main gate, drawn by the terrifying sound and the plume of dust still hanging in the air. Their faces were masks of disbelief, slowly crumbling into raw fear. Clara Massey, Frank's wife, was among the first. She clutched the chain-link fence, her knuckles white, her eyes locked on the destroyed mine entrance. Maria Gallo, her pregnant belly a stark symbol of the life at stake, was helped from a car, her face pale with shock. The scene at the entrance was one of chaos and devastation. The steel-reinforced concrete portal to the main tunnel was gone, replaced by a mountain of jagged rock and twisted metal tracks. There was no way in. Mine Superintendent Arthur Henderson arrived, projecting an air of calm that seemed disturbingly unnatural. He assured the frantic families that Consolidated Minerals had the best rescue teams in the world, and that they were already being mobilized. His words were smooth, practiced, but they rang hollow against the backdrop of the silent Broken Mountain. The first 911 calls flooded the county dispatcher. "There's been a collapse at Black Rock," one caller, a surface mechanic, stammered. "A big one. The whole entrance is gone. I think the whole morning shift is trapped down there." The initial search began not as a coordinated effort, but as a desperate, frantic scramble by the other miners, who grabbed shovels and picks, clawing uselessly at the wall of debris. They were held back by their supervisors, who warned of secondary collapses. The initial confusion gave way to a dawning, sickening realization. This was not a minor cave-in. This was a cataclysm. 18 men were somewhere in the dark, thousands of feet below, and the only door to their world had just been irrevocably slammed shut. The formal rescue operation that spun up over the next 24 hours was a massive, impressive-looking display of force. Heavy machinery rumbled into Jericho Springs, Teams from the Mine Safety and Health Administration arrived in government vehicles, and news helicopters buzzed overhead like vultures. For the families huddled near the gates, this initial flurry of activity brought a fragile sliver of hope, but that hope would soon be ground down by a lethal combination of corporate obstruction, brutal weather, and sheer tragic incompetence. The primary conflict point was immediately apparent. The rescuers needed accurate mine schematics to know where to drill exploratory shafts, hoping to reach potential air pockets where the men might have survived. The maps provided by Consolidated Minerals, approved by Superintendent Henderson, were strangely outdated. They showed geological formations that didn't match seismic readings and omitted several recently excavated tunnels, including a critical secondary passage near the Widowmaker seam. Rescue teams, acting on this flawed information, spent the first crucial 48 hours drilling in the wrong locations, wasting precious time and resources. The family's frustration quickly turned to anger. In tense meetings, they confronted Henderson, accusing his company of providing bad maps. Henderson blamed the errors on clerical mistakes and the chaotic nature of the situation, his apologies slick and empty. He assured everyone that corrected maps were on their way, but the delays were inexcusable. Then, the environment itself turned against them. On the third day, a freak early winter blizzard swept through the region, dumping 2 feet of snow and bringing savage winds that made surface operations impossible. The storm grounded all air support and turned the rescue site into a treacherous landscape of mud and ice. The effort was halted for 36 critical hours. When it resumed, tragedy struck. A rescue helicopter, attempting to ferry specialized drilling equipment to a remote ridge, was caught in a sudden violent downdraft. It slammed into the side of the mountain and exploded, killing the 2 pilots. The accident cast a pall of death over the entire operation, shattering morale and compounding the sense of hopelessness. The drilling itself was a slow, agonizing process. The rock was dangerously unstable, and teams had to contend with constant threats of secondary collapses and pockets of lethal methane gas. On the 9th day, a drill bit finally broke through into a void. Hopes soared, but a remote camera revealed only a small, empty chamber filled with toxic air. It was a crushing blow. After 3 weeks of fruitless, heartbreaking effort, the official search was called off. Consolidated Minerals released a statement declaring the 18 miners lost, citing the lack of any signs of life, the hazardous conditions, and the impossibility of survival. They sealed the mine entrance with thousands of tons of concrete, turning a rescue site into a permanent gravesite. For the families, it was the ultimate betrayal. They believed the search was abandoned not because it was hopeless, but because it was expensive, and the company had decided it was cheaper to bury the dead than to find them. The concrete seal on the Black Rock mine hardened, and so did the hearts of many in Jericho Springs. The caravan of news trucks and rescue vehicles departed, leaving the town to drown in a silence that was heavier and more profound than the noise that had preceded it. The case of the lost 18 was officially closed, but for the community, it remained a raw, open wound. The passage of years did little to heal it. The tragedy became the town's defining feature, a grim anchor in its history. Consolidated Minerals paid out a settlement to the families, a sum that felt more like blood money than compensation, contingent on a non-disclosure agreement that legally silenced their questions. Most of the families took the money and left, unable to look at the mountain each day without seeing a tombstone. They scattered across the country, trying to outrun a memory that was permanently etched into their souls. A few, like Frank Massey's widow Clara, stayed. She became the town's silent matriarch of grief, tending to the simple granite memorial that was eventually erected near the sealed mine entrance. The memorial listed the 18 names, a stark roll call of the lives extinguished. Maria Gallo gave birth to her daughter, Hope, a week after the search was called off. She moved to California, determined to raise her child far from the shadow of the mine. But she would tell Hope stories of the brave, smiling father she never met. The Black Rock mine itself became a place of dark folklore. Locals whispered stories of hearing phantom tapping from deep within the earth on cold, quiet nights. Teenagers would dare each other to touch the cold concrete seal. The site became a grim landmark, a place of pilgrimage for dark tourists and amateur ghost hunters. It was dubbed the Sleeping Tomb, and the 18 miners became Jericho's sleeping beauties, locked in an eternal slumber from which they would never wake. The town of Jericho Springs slowly withered. With the mine closed, the economic heart had been ripped out. Businesses shuttered, houses were abandoned, and a permanent air of melancholy settled over the dusty streets. The failure to recover the bodies left a void that could never be filled. There were no funerals, no graves to visit, just a concrete slab and a lingering, corrosive sense of injustice. The world moved on, but in Jericho Springs, time was frozen on November 2nd, 1987. The mystery of what exactly happened in those final moments was buried along with the men, a secret the mountain seemed determined to keep forever. For 38 years, the mountain kept its secret. The story of the Lost 18 faded from national headlines into a footnote of industrial history, a tragedy remembered only by those who lived it. The town of Jericho Springs was a ghost of its former self. The world had largely forgotten, but the earth does not forget. In 2025, the land that housed the defunct Black Rock mine was purchased by GeoCorp, a modern, aggressive geothermal energy corporation. Their plan had nothing to do with mining ore. They were hunting for thermal energy, drilling deeper into the planet's crust than any mining operation ever had. To them, the sealed mine was just a surface feature on a geological survey map, a historical curiosity irrelevant to their mission. They set up a massive state-of-the-art drilling rig several miles from the original mine entrance. Their objective was to sink an exploratory bore straight down, over 10,000 feet, to assess the geothermal potential of the rock strata. The GeoCorp engineers, using advanced seismic imaging, had mapped what they believed was a solid, uninterrupted mass of granite. The old, flawed schematics from Consolidated Minerals were filed away in a county records office, unconsulted and forgotten. The drilling commenced. For weeks, the powerful diamond-tipped drill bit chewed through rock with predictable efficiency. Then, at a depth of 3,200 feet, something unexpected happened. The drill suddenly lost all resistance, plunging into a void. Alarms blared in the control trailer. The lead geologist, a woman named Dr. Lena Petrova, stared at her monitors in confusion. According to all their data, there should be nothing but solid rock at that depth. They had hit a cavern, a pocket in the earth that simply wasn't supposed to be there. Standard procedure was to deploy a fiber-optic bore camera to inspect the anomaly. The team lowered the small, armored camera down the hole. On the screen in the trailer, the dark, muddy image slowly clarified as the lens was cleaned by a remote jet. It showed a space, not a natural cave, but a man-made chamber. The camera panned across the floor, revealing the rusted, derelict husks of mining equipment. Petrova and her team exchanged stunned looks. They had inadvertently drilled directly into a lost section of the old Black Rock mine, a section far from the main entrance, and at a depth no one had believed could contain a survivable space. The camera continued its slow pan, and then it stopped. It focused on a wide, flat section of the cavern wall. The high-intensity LED light illuminated the surface. It wasn't bare rock. It was covered in writing. The discovery sent a shockwave through the quiet remnants of Jericho Springs and into the national consciousness. The 38-year-old cold case was instantly, explosively reopened. A new team was assembled, a fusion of GeoCorp's technical experts, forensic geologists, and federal investigators. Leading the new forensic probe was Dr. Eris Thorne, a sharp, determined geologist from the University of Nevada. For Thorne, the case was personal. His grandfather had been Sam Jones's best friend and had never stopped believing there was more to the story. The first step was to secure the chamber. Instead of a risky human entry, Thorne's team deployed a sophisticated robotic drone, smaller and more agile than the initial camera. Guided by an expert pilot, the drone navigated the narrow borehole and entered the lost cavern. The air inside, sensors revealed, had been breathable for a time, sustained by a slow seep of water reacting with minerals, but had long since become toxic. The drone's lights cut through the blackness, revealing the scene with heartbreaking clarity. The remains of the 18 miners were there, huddled together in a makeshift shelter they had carved out. They had survived the initial collapse, but it was the wall that held the true revelation. The drone's high-definition camera began to slowly scan the writing, transmitting the images back to the command center, where a silent, stunned audience watched. It was a diary. Frank Massey, the foreman, had used a piece of chalk to chronicle their final days. The first entries detailed their desperate attempts to dig out, their rationing of food and water, and their efforts to keep morale up. Leo Gallo had added a message to his unborn daughter, telling her he loved her, and that her mother was the strongest woman he knew. Sam Jones had written a simple, powerful line, "Clara, I love you more than life." But as the days wore on, the tone of the message shifted from one of survival to one of witness. Frank Massey's writing became sharp, precise, and accusatory. He described the moments just before the collapse. It wasn't the groaning of rock they had heard. It was something else. Heard 3 distinct blasts. The wall read, "Timed charges, not a cave-in. This was deliberate. Henderson was here." He knew. The drone's camera panned further down the wall. Here, the writing was from another miner who had used a sharp rock to scratch into the stone after the chalk ran out. The message was chilling. They had stumbled upon something a week earlier in a deep, uncharted spur of the mine. A massive, incredibly rich vein of gold. It wasn't on any company maps. They realized Consolidated Minerals was running a clandestine, illegal mining operation, smuggling out millions in undeclared gold. They had reported their finding to Foreman Massey, who had scheduled the meeting with Henderson. The collapse happened just hours before that meeting was supposed to take place. The men understood the horrifying truth in their final days. They hadn't been the victims of an accident. They had been witnesses who were being permanently silenced. The final damning piece of the message was a single name, scratched frantically into the rock. "Henderson! He sealed us in. He murdered us." The drone's camera zoomed in on those last words. In the command trailer, a silence thicker than any rock descended. They had not found a tomb. They had found a crime scene, and the victims themselves had left behind the name of their killer. The revelation from the cavern wall transformed a 38-year-old tragedy into an active murder investigation. The scrawled message was treated as a dying declaration, a powerful and admissible piece of evidence. The FBI immediately took over the case. Their first target was Arthur Henderson. Now 86 years old, he was living a life of immense wealth and luxury in a gated community in Scottsdale, Arizona. He was the former CEO of Consolidated Minerals, having been promoted rapidly after the unfortunate Black Rock incident. When federal agents arrived at his sprawling mansion, he was defiant, dismissing the claims as the fantastical ramblings of dead men. But the evidence was no longer just a message on a wall. Armed with the new information, investigators reopened the archives. They discovered that a warehouse fire in 1988, ruled an accident at the time, had destroyed most of Consolidated Minerals' operational records from the Black Rock site. However, a backup set of geological surveys and shipping manifests, misfiled in a subsidiary's office in Salt Lake City, had survived. These documents were the smoking gun. They detailed a massive off-the-books gold extraction operation, correlating perfectly with the miner's claim. Shipping logs, signed by Henderson himself, showed tons of waste rock being shipped to a private smelter with no official record. The total value of the stolen gold was estimated to be over $2 billion in today's money. Investigators also tracked down 2 demolition experts who had been on the company's payroll in 1987 under the guise of a safety audit team. Faced with conspiracy and murder charges, one of them confessed. He detailed how Henderson had hired them to place a series of strategically timed charges at key structural points in the main tunnel. The plan was to create a controlled collapse that would be indistinguishable from a natural cave-in, entombing the entire morning shift who were working near the secret gold vein. The motive was pure, cold-blooded greed. Henderson and a small circle of corrupt executives had discovered the gold seam and decided to plunder it for themselves. The 18 miners, led by the observant Frank Massey, had stumbled upon their secret. Silencing them was a simple, brutal business decision. The failed rescue attempt was also revealed to be a deliberate act of sabotage. Henderson had intentionally provided rescuers with falsified maps to lead them away from the cavern, where he knew the men were likely located. He knew they had survived the initial collapse and had a limited supply of air. He just had to run out the clock, and the blizzard and helicopter crash had been tragic but convenient cover. Henderson's carefully constructed world crumbled. Faced with irrefutable evidence and his accomplice's testimony, He was arrested and charged with 18 counts of first-degree murder and massive financial fraud. The recovery of the miners' remains was a somber, meticulous process. Each one was carefully brought to the surface, a journey home that was 38 years overdue. For the families, the news was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The confirmation of their loved ones' deaths was a reopening of an old, deep wound, but the discovery of the truth brought a strange, painful sense of relief. The gnawing uncertainty that had haunted them for decades was finally gone. They had answers. The most powerful moment of closure came when the investigators gathered the surviving relatives, children who were now middle-aged, grandchildren who had only known their grandfathers through faded photographs, and read them the full transcript from the cavern wall. They heard Frank Massey's final loving words to his wife. They listened to Sam Jones's quiet message of devotion, and Hope Gallo, now a 38-year-old woman with a family of her own, finally heard her father's voice. She wept as the investigator read Leo's message written in chalk in the dark. "To my daughter, Hope, I will not get to hold you, but know that my last thought was of you. Be brave, your father loves you." For the first time, she had more than a story. She had her father's own words, a direct connection to the man she never knew. It was a moment of profound grief and catharsis. The town of Jericho Springs, long a place of sorrow, became a center for this delayed mourning. A formal funeral was held for all 18 men. Caskets representing each miner were carried down the town's main street, which was lined with thousands of people from across the country who had been moved by the story. It was the funeral they had been denied for nearly 4 decades. The service brought a sense of peace that had long eluded the community. The men were no longer the lost 18, defined by their disappearance. They were remembered by their names, their stories, and their final courageous act of bearing witness. The ghosts of the Black Rock Mine were finally, truly laid to rest. The case of the Black Rock Mine became more than just a story of a long unsolved crime. It evolved into a chilling parable about the depths of corporate greed and the incredible resilience of truth. It demonstrated that no crime, no matter how carefully buried under layers of rock and decades of lies, can be hidden forever. The final message left by the miners was a testament to the human spirit's insistence on justice, a voice from the grave that refused to be silenced. It highlighted a stark contrast, the immeasurable value of 18 lives against a company executive's cold calculation of profit and loss. The public outcry following the revelations was immense. It led to tangible change. Spurred by the advocacy of the miners' families, Congress passed the Black Rock Legacy Act. This new federal law established far more stringent regulations for mine safety, mandated the preservation of operational data, and, most importantly, created powerful new whistleblower protections for workers who report corporate malfeasance. It held corporate executives criminally liable for safety failures that result in death, piercing the corporate veil that had protected men like Henderson for so long. The story served as a permanent reminder that the true cost of industry is not measured in dollars, but in human lives. The legacy of the 18 men was not one of victimhood, but of defiance. In their darkest hour, facing certain death, they performed one last act of courage. They recorded the truth, transforming their tomb into a tablet of testimony, ensuring that their story would one day be heard. For 38 years, their voices were silenced by a mountain of rock and a conspiracy of lies. But their final message echoed through time to demand justice and expose a terrible truth. The story of the Lost 18 is a haunting reminder that some secrets refuse to stay buried. If this story of truth and betrayal resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more true crime mysteries that delve into the darkness. We want to hear your thoughts. Tell us in the comments, what do you believe is the most shocking part of this corporate cover-up?